Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 285. Do you know anything about Bugzilla? Sometimes the answer to a simple, unexpected question can push us in a new direction. Today, Max Kanat-Alexander is a principal staff software engineer at LinkedIn, and he's one of the technical leads for the developer productivity and happiness team. Years ago, when someone at work asked Max if he knew anything about Bugzilla, he was able to say yes. You see, Max did bug triage for the Mozilla project in college while he was studying computer science. Not only would Max learn how to deploy and administer Bugzilla through this experience, but he got heavily involved in its development as an open source project. In this part one of our discussion with Max, you'll hear advice for those participating in open source, and we'll answer the following question. At what job level in software engineering would someone be considered a technical lead? Here we go with part one of our discussion with Max Kanat-Alexander. Max Kanat-Alexander, welcome to Nerd Journey.
Thanks.
Appreciate you being here. Let's start by telling our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do today, please.
Sure. Well, yeah, my name is Max. I am a principal staff software engineer at LinkedIn, and I'm one of the technical leads for the developer productivity and happiness team.
Oh, wow. So much to unpack there. But I want to go back to the very beginning, Max, because nobody starts at that level. I think if I recall correctly, you studied computer science in college. What prompted you to seek out that line of study originally?
So I'd always been really into computers, at least ever since I'd had one. There was an old Tandy and an old 286 at one of my schools. One of them was broken, and I just took that as a personal challenge when I was about 8 years old to try to mess with it until I could get it to work. I learned a lot, that was my first, I think, defrag that I ever ran on a computer. And, I just started poking around with it until I could learn. And over time, eventually my parents bought a computer and I had it and I broke that one too. From there forward, it was really just a lot of working with computers. I had summer jobs that were being IT technicians when I was younger, right before high school and during high school. Then when I went into college, I was either going to major in theater or in physics or in computer science. Those are sort of my three different avenues that I wanted to go in.
Very different avenues.
They're very different. And I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I started off being a theater major, actually. And I quickly discovered that, at least at UC Santa Cruz, the theater major was very theory heavy. And I did not want to study the theory of theater. I wanted to act and direct and produce shows. And so I changed to my next equal interest, basically, which was computers. And the only computer-related major that they had was computer science.
And when we say computer science, at that time, are we talking about both computer architecture and the hardware guts and how they work and programming, or just more of a programming focus?
Really much more of a programming focus. In the very first classes, they teach you some of the really important basics that you need to know. And then after that, it's much more algorithms and math and things like that.
Okay. Had you done any of the programming before in your tinkering and summer jobs, or was that completely new?
In high school, in math class, often instead of paying attention, I would try to program my TI-83.
Oh yeah, those are fun.
Yeah, I had a ton of fun with it. tried to make it make different interesting graphs. And I was really into prime numbers. So I was always trying to make prime solvers on my TI-83. And so I spent a lot of high school math classes writing prime solvers on my TI-83.
So many fun programming opportunities on those calculators. I remember it as well. As you got into the programming aspect, did you have a certain sense of what you wanted to do with it from there? Was there anyone who guided you on, here's where you should look to get a job based on what you're studying?
So let's see. I went to college from 1999 to 2003, and there wasn't a lot of mentorship in the world about what you should do with your career in the late 90s and early 2000s as far as software engineering went. There had been the dot-com boom and bubble, and it was still going on. Actually, one of my roommates was pulled out of college to go work at Sun, I think, as I recall, and they offered him what to us was an enormous amount of money at the time, being college students, something like 70 grand right out of college,
Oh, wow.
to be pulled out in his sophomore year. To me, that was crazy. There wasn't a lot of that going around, and there wasn't a lot of advice. So it was more just I really like computers. And my impression of my classmates was they were either people who I really like computers, or their parents were you need to go do something that looks like math or science. And those were the two sort of different sets of people who were in my classes usually. People who had been sort of pushed in that direction by their parents, or people who just were really passionate about computers to begin with.
Walk us through getting out of school and that first job and how you ended up getting into software development.
Sure. So let me back it up a little bit. Starting from when I was about 14 years old, I had been building FileMaker databases for people. One of my summer jobs was that I built a FileMaker database of stunt actors for stunt shows for theme parks. And I did that when I was 14 or 15, I think. Then in college, I had a job where I had to make a FileMaker database for the college and university housing services, which tracked all the data about housing and people who were living in it. And then I had another summer job where I made a FileMaker database. And FileMaker databases are a really nice, gentle introduction to programming because they give you the components to do most of what you need to do without writing actual software. But they give you a scripting language that's very click on this and then say what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so at least gives you an introduction to the concepts of programming. So I'd had these jobs all throughout college. And that last job that I had with the college and university housing services, I had all the way until the end of my college tenure. And when I left school, I still had more IT experience than I had programming experience. And really all of these jobs that I'd had been IT jobs where I just had coincidentally been making a FileMaker database, or one time I programmed in Cold Fusion. And if any of your listeners don't know, it is a now mostly defunct XML-based programming language that was actually kind of nice, sort of an early version of what most people would think of as templating languages nowadays. And eventually I learned to, do basic web pages, very basic web pages as part of my IT job. But I still had, the jobs were still basically IT jobs. Also coincidentally, I, being a big nerd, really decided, I got really into Linux in college, and I installed Red Hat 9 on my computer. And the way that I am is that I decided that I wanted to live on the edge, and that I wanted to just constantly update to whatever the next development version of Red Hat was. And it turned out that the difference between Red Hat 9 and Red Hat 10 was there was no Red Hat 10. There was Fedora 1. And as a result, I was one of the only people in the world who had been using Fedora effectively for months before it came out. And so I wrote the very first support webpage ever for Fedora, which was called the Fedora FAQ. And it was for a while the only support resource and the most popular support resource on the internet for Fedora. I was getting 120,000 unique visitors a month to a one-page website.
Wow.
So when I got hired, I was hired to be basically a cross OS IT type technician. My first job out of college was for a company called Cario. They're most famous for making a Windows firewall back when Windows did not have a very good built-in firewall. And they also made a mail server, and they made a router that actually runs on Windows. So a software router that runs on Windows called WinRoute. And they hired me to basically be the lead technician for their tech support for America. So I did that, and I answered phone calls and handled tickets and, helped the other two technicians who worked with me. And that was fun. I got to work on a lot of complicated problems with people on their mail servers and routers and stuff like that. It was very interesting. So there was a very small company, so people just have multiple hats. So the marketing director came in and he said, "Do you know anything about Bugzilla?" And I said, "Yeah, I do," because once again, being the way that I am, one of the ways that I had spent my free time in college was triaging bugs for the Mozilla project. I just found this very interesting. So for anybody who doesn't know, triage is somebody has reported a bug, but nobody knows if it's valid or not. Nobody knows if it can be reproduced. Nobody knows if it has sufficient information. And nobody knows if it's a duplicate of a pre-existing bug. And somebody has to go through and actually do that work. And at the time, in around 1999 or 2000, when I was doing that, all that work for the Mozilla project was done by volunteers, including me. I probably triaged maybe 100 bugs. I don't know how many it was. And so I had used Bugzilla extensively because that was the bug tracking system of the Mozilla project. And so he said, "Do you know anything about Bugzilla?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, well, we'd like you to install it for us." And I said, "All right." Bugzilla was famously ugly. Also, it ran on MySQL. And at the time, I was much more familiar with Postgres. I had done more work personally in Postgres, and I actually liked it. Had a lot more interesting feature set. And I think if you're a programmer and you just love SQL and you love standards and you want to perfection and you want every feature available from the SQL language, then Postgres is your jam because it really that's really the database that does that thing. So I installed a fork of Bugzilla, a modified version of it that Red Hat had made. And that version had a slightly nicer user interface and it ran on Postgres. And that was great until we wanted to upgrade because Red Hat had stopped maintaining that fork. So I decided that, I would still make this upgrade happen. And so, there's two ways you can make this upgrade happen. One of them is you can copy all the data from Postgres into MySQL. That's, requires a bit of work. You have to write a script and figure out how to do it right. Maybe a week or two of work. Or you can make upstream Bugzilla support Postgres, which is what the choice that I made. I was very much keen on the open source spirit, and I felt like that spirit was contribute back to the world rather than just back to yourself.
You mentioned you made the FAQ site for Fedora, this public contribution at the time. Was there someone in your life that modeled that, hey, we need to give back for the greater learning? Or was that something you just decided on your own?
Okay, so interesting point. I think there's two things here. One of them is that when I was doing bug triage for the Bugzilla project, I was not a programmer. There was a lot of technology that I loved, and I wanted to work more with it. But the only thing that I could do was do this bug triage because I didn't have programming skills. But I did love computers, and I really appreciated Mozilla, and I wanted to succeed. So I think there was an inherent motivation there. And then with the Fedora FAQ, I tried multiple times to get somebody else to write this thing because the reason that I wrote it was I was sitting in the Fedora support channel on IRC. For anybody who's not familiar, IRC is the form of chat that we used before Slack and Discord. Some people do still use it. And people would come in and ask questions all the time. I mean, I was there because I had originally had questions, right? But then people just had endless questions and we were just answering the same questions over and over and over. And I begged multiple people to please write an FAQ so that I don't have to keep answering the same questions over and over. And nobody did it. And finally I was like, fine, I'll do it myself. It was wildly successful. Somebody else just could have done it. Anybody in that channel could have just done it and it would have been wildly successful. And so after a while, I started to get this impression that if I didn't do something, nobody else was going to do it. And that was very true on the Bugzilla project as well. I suspect that if I had not gone in there and written that database layer, I don't know that anybody else in the world would ever have made Bugzilla have multi-database support.
You mentioned the starting off with bug triaging. So what I'm thinking about here is someone who's not a programmer today but wants to slide into that or get more skilled in it. Can they do the same sort of thing and be reporting bugs on GitHub for the open source project that they love or enjoy working with as a way to take a step in that direction?
Yeah, it really depends on the state of the project. In general, I encourage anybody who wants to become a better programmer to work on open source. It's a really great way to be able to flex your skills or learn new skills in an environment where mostly people really want your contributions. They desperately want other people to do work. That's one of the hardest things in open source is getting people to do work for you. So if you show up and you're like, I want to do work, people are like, yeah. I mean, there's a few communities where people are more toxic and they're going to be like, nah, you're a noob, go away. That's very rare. Most of the time, anything you can do, honestly, some of the non-programming skills are actually more valuable. Like if you have any design skills, any open source project would love to have you. Any open source project that has a UI absolutely desperately needs you. There are no open source user interface designers. They do not exist. So if you have that skill and you want to have artifacts that you can point to in your resume and say, look, I did this, and programmers will know what it is, man, what an opportunity.
Yeah, because you can point to it and point them to your GitHub and they can see you've made those contributions now. Maybe it probably wasn't as easy to see before when you were contributing to the Mozilla project.
Yeah, but you can still see that, like, because you could go to Mozilla's Bugzilla and you can see that I did 10,000 code reviews.
10,000. Wow. That's incredible.
That's my recollection of the number. I would have to go back and look at it again, but my recollection is somewhere around that number.
And how did you find that you could contribute in that way originally to the Mozilla project?
Which one? The triage?
Yeah, the bug triaging.
Man, I don't remember. That was back in my sophomore year of college. Maybe I tried to file a bug and it made me go search for duplicates. And I was like, all of these are unconfirmed. And then I started to look at them and I'm naturally like a cleaner. And so I saw these things and they looked messy. And I was like, oh, I got to clean this up.
I love the dedication and the desire to, okay, I'm going to go with option 2 and improve this fork, make it support multiple databases. Now, when you decided to do that, did you have any idea how to go about doing it, or did you just decide the path and then figure it out along the way?
I had enough programming experience at that point to at least have opinions. So I had written like a Java app over the summer once, and then I had written a fairly extensive application in Cold Fusion during college that I spent maybe 100 or 120 or maybe 200 hours on. And so I at least had fairly strong opinions about how software should be structured. I did have to learn Perl, which is the language that it was written in, but Perl is not that hard to learn. It is difficult to master. Of all the languages that I've ever learned, Perl is one of the hardest, if not the hardest to master, but really easy to get started.
And while we're kind of talking about these parallels of your career and people contributing to open source today, if someone says, yes, contributing to open source sounds really interesting, I just don't know what project to pick. Any guidance on where to push them and where they can contribute?
Generally, I would say find something that you use or care about or that's similar to something that interests you and go and find that community and see if you can contribute to it. Because you're going to be more interested and more invested if it's something that you use or that matters to you.
Makes total sense. And there are so many different open source projects out there that someone can choose from. Is there a way to kind of look at one and see if it's maybe a red flag? I wouldn't contribute here because there's not much work being done?
Yeah. So go look at how frequent the commits are. Go look at how many issues there are filed and how responsive they are to the issues. So look at how updated the issues are. Like, are people constantly updating and closing issues, or are there just filed issues, and no response? If there are any PRs, look at the PRs and see if there's like a healthy discussion that goes on in those PRs. And you also will get a sense from looking at the PRs of the tone and the nature of the culture of the community and whether or not you want to be part of that. Some communities might be a little more aggressive and direct, and some communities might be a little more polite and reserved, and you have to decide which one more suits your style of work.
Right. And what you're looking for specifically is the feedback people are getting on not only the pull request, but any code changes that they're suggesting or documentation changes they're suggesting, right?
Yeah, and the issues. And also a lot of the time they'll link to a Discord or a Slack channel, and you can just go and hang out in there and see how alive is it? How many recent messages have there been? Things like that.
Yeah. Take the heartbeat of the community. I like that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to your story with the upgrading to multi-database support for Bugzilla. When you told the folks who had hired you to install this for them that you were going to do that, what was the reaction? I mean, were they confident it could be achieved, or?
That's not what I told them. They asked, we want to upgrade because there's these new features that we want. And I said, okay, great. I'm going to make that happen. And then eventually, I did tell them, this is the way that I'm doing it. And I think there was a healthy degree of skepticism, I would say, about my work. But as long as I got my normal work done, everybody was okay. At that time, I think I actually worked more. Like I was at the office more than I had been in the past because I was spending a few hours a day working on Bugzilla in one way or another.
Yeah, sometimes that drive, excitement, focus on solving a problem that's interesting to you can give you the energy shot you need to do that extra work, put in the extra time, sweat equity to carry it to the finish line.
Yeah, that was true for the whole time I worked on Bugzilla. I would work on it, and we'll talk more about that, but I would work on it all the time because I just was so interested in the problem that I was solving.
Well, it kind of goes back to what you said before. You wanted to be able to tinker with and work on the things centered around computers that were interesting to you. And since you had done triaging in Bugzilla previously, you already knew some of the mechanics of how it was supposed to work and how a user would use it. So you flip to the other side and you start programming its functionality on the backside. I would imagine that just strengthens your enjoyment of that product or project.
It definitely does. Because you own it. You feel like it's your baby.
Oh yeah. You're contributing code. You've built part of it, and you actually got to carry that baby for a while and watch it grow. So how did you end up staying involved in it for so long after this initial foray into it?
So I made my changes in Bugzilla 2.19. And here's the way that the Bugzilla versioning system works. The way the Bugzilla versioning system works is the first number is the major version, rarely ever changes. Second number, evens are stable releases, and odds are the current development release, basically. Like, you only want to be using the development release if you really want to live on the edge and you don't want things to work. You're fine with things breaking. And so my changes all went into 2.19, which would become 2.20 once it was released. However, there was a problem. The problem was 2.18 had never been released. So 2.20 couldn't be released because 2.18 had not been released, and it had been years. And it had been, the project was really struggling. 2.16 was not great. It had a lot of really bad UI problems, and there was a lot of competitors to Bugzilla showing up in the world. This was around the time, I think, that Jira started to exist and become popular, as an example, very early in these days. But my motivation was, in a way, slightly more selfish, which was that I needed to be able to upgrade to 2.20 to demonstrate that I had done work, because my work was done. I had finished the multi-database platform and couldn't release it. And I was like, once again, it's very much like the Fedora FAQ. I went around, I bugged everybody. I was like, can you please release 2.18? Can you please release it? And they were like, well, somebody just has to burn down these bugs. There's bugs in 2.17 that have to be burned down so that 2.18 can be released. And then somebody has to do work. There's work that you have to package it up. You have to write release notes. You have to send out announcements. And I was like, fine, I'll do it. I'll just do it. I'll just release 2.18. So as one discovers, as one goes through one's history and life as a technician or any kind of technologist, if you accept responsibility for anything unpopular, it will become your job. Or if you express an opinion about anything that anybody else doesn't want to work on, it will become your job. This has happened consistently for the rest of my career. So I became the release manager of the Bugzilla project. And as a result, I released 2.18. And then a few months later, once we got 2.19 through the same process, which I drove, we released 2.20. And through that process, I became more and more involved. I had to do code reviews so that people could get their changes in. I had to approve changes. I had to do all the packaging. I had to make sure that the test infrastructure was working. And I started to become more and more involved in the community. We had this long-term goal to do this major performance improvement that required a lot of refactoring. And so I led the project through a lot of those refactorings, and I ended up doing a lot of them. I got really interested in them. So I love refactoring. Like, I can refactor all day. I know confidently, because I've done it, I could every day come into work and refactor a code base for 6 months and be just absolutely thrilled. I didn't just do that with Bugzilla, though. The way we did it with Bugzilla is every time we were about to write a feature, we would refactor that. And if anybody submitted a patch that was really like a hack on top of a bad system, we would tell them, we're not going to accept your patch until you refactor the thing that you just changed to be better. And we would tell them how to do it. We'd say, like, this is the changes you need to make. And sometimes you would lose contributors, but most of the time people would go, okay. And then they would do the refactoring, and then they would send you a patch. And they were almost always very grateful, because they were like, wow, it was so much easier. And actually, like, I spotted some bugs in my patch because the code is much easier to read now, and all these things. Through a series of years, I got really involved in refactoring Bugzilla. Eventually, I became the chief architect and one of the 2 co-leads of the project. Me and my co-lead, Frederic, we were the co-leads of the project. There was technically a lead above us, Dave Miller, who is now, I believe, still the lead of the project. In those days, all he did was resolve disputes. If me and Frederic disagreed, he was the resolver, that was rare. That happened maybe 2 or 3 times in the whole time that I worked on the project. And I became basically like responsible for the project. I also became the community lead, which meant that I was involved in like trying to recruit people, trying to make our documentation for new recruits better, trying to retain people instead of losing them, try to help get people more active in the community, make sure that the community was a healthy and welcoming place. I learned a lot, and I just loved it. And I eventually left Cario, and I started a company that was originally called Everything Solved. And primarily what we did was we did Bugzilla consulting.
Oh, there's so much to dig into here. So you went from contributor and builder of this release that you wanted to get out the door. And before that, you had done bug triaging. And then you were fixing bugs from previous releases that had to go out before yours could go out. It's almost like you got to look at cross sections of a house from a bunch of different angles to really understand the entire system, which, as you said, pretty much made you a perfect fit for that chief architecture role, because you had seen all those elements working together, how they fit together in this package. I want to ask about the terminology you used, refactor. When we say refactor for purposes of this discussion, I think what you mean is cleaning up the code, making it simpler, easier to read, maybe even execute in a more efficient way to use less resources. Is that right?
Yes, without changing the behavior that users experience.
Okay, cool. So you were a contributor. I think when you became one of the leads with Federico, that's what we might call a maintainer in the GitHub world.
Yeah.
Did you understand how the releases worked well enough from trying to write the 2.20 release? Or did you find your depth of understanding was a little bit lacking when you had to go back and manage the releases?
Oh, I knew nothing. I knew absolutely nothing. I depended on Dave Miller, the project lead, to tell me what I had to do. He just didn't have the time to do it. At the time, he was one of Mozilla's only sysadmins, and they were very busy. I believe this was right around the time the Mozilla Foundation started, shortly after the Mozilla Foundation started. So no, Dave had to tell me everything, and I learned entirely by asking him questions, and then eventually I think I wrote down the procedure that I learned from him.
Could someone at a high level today master the concepts and mechanics of release management without really understanding how to write code well? Or is that not really possible?
It depends on how complicated your releases are. If you have very simple releases and you have a really good release pipeline that somebody else, like a really good deployment system or a really good release system that somebody else has made, then you could be a release manager, because a lot of it is project management. A lot of it is just like, hey, let's figure out what the list of bugs are that we have to do before we release. Let's make sure that all those are in a list. Let's have a regular meeting that says, hey, we're going to burn these down. Or we didn't have meetings. I just like would ping people on IRC and be like, hey, so this is the thing you got to do it when you're going to do it by. And so the project management aspect of it, yeah, you could do it without programming, but any sort of complicated release or really and most open source projects, no, you have to be a programmer.
Okay. I was just curious if the release manager angle is an entry point to get into the software development world and allow you to sharpen your coding skills later on.
Well, I would say yes, actually, because the kind of coding that you need to do is not very complicated. Like you're much more just writing scripts to automate work that you would otherwise be doing manually. And at the worst, you can do some of that work manually. You do have to be competent with computers and you do have to be competent with handling people to do work. But if you can do those two things, the parts that involve programming are very learnable. But it actually is a pretty good entry point into programming.
And is that a role you see translating into organizations these days, like a dedicated release manager? Or is release management more like a function that's spread across many team members?
I think nowadays the trend is to make the software engineers do the releases themselves so that they understand and feel the pain that they are causing for release. And so I don't see it as much as a separate role. Occasionally, when teams have very complicated release systems, they do have dedicated release managers, but it's becoming more and more rare.
Yeah, good to know. Let's go back to the community lead for a second. I know you wrote the FAQ for Fedora. I know you had done all this work for the project, but once you become this community lead who's trying to recruit people to the project, what did you have to do differently at that point than maybe you had been doing?
I think you have to take a broader responsibility because at first you're just a member of the community. And if things are going wrong around you, you might want to do something about it. You might be upset that somebody's being mean to another person, but that's somebody else's problem. At the very worst, you go and you talk to the project lead and you say, hey, this person's being mean to this person. What are you going to do? Or like you go, oh man, the documentation for getting started is really hard, but that's not my problem. I'm just going to go figure out how to get started by asking a bunch of people. When you're the community lead, all of those things are your problem. I would say the most important thing you need to manage as the community lead is the on-ramp process to the project. How do people know that you're accepting contributors? How do they know how to contribute? How do they know what the rules are? Like, how do they submit changes? And then what's the process they're going to go through for those changes? What are the expectations of them? And then what's an entry point for them? Like, are there particular issues that you have tagged in some way where they can get started with those? And so that's one of the things we did in the Bugzilla project is we're like, okay, if there are certain things that are like, we're not going to get to them, but they're relatively straightforward for a new person, we would just tag them with a particular tag. And then we would have a list that you could just click on that was a search. They would say, hey, here's all of these. But I had to invent that system. I had to say, here's a system we're going to use. And it actually benefited us as well as a team because it allowed us to sort of shove a bunch of these minor issues that we were never going to have time for into a queue that could actually get handled by people who care.
Right. Crowdsourcing it, getting extra hands, almost like the big corporation that brings in interns to help with different things that they might tag in the same sort of way.
Yeah. And then once they've done it, the other thing is, as soon as somebody shows up in an open source project, if you want to keep people, you need to be visibly and voluminously appreciative. People in open source show up because they love programming and they care about your project and they want to work with you. And they may have day jobs as programmers that they don't like. And there's various reasons that they don't like them. But one of them is they might feel like the thing that they work on is something that they don't care about and that nobody appreciates. Very often, the pay that you get for working on open source is appreciation in your life. Like the value that you get is both the sense of having delivered impact to the world and owning something really important for the world, and then also appreciation. And then on the flip side, any negativity that you get, you don't have to put up with that. Nobody's paying you. You just leave.
Right. It's easier to walk away than just to throw your hands up and let the place burn down as a software developer in any paying job.
Yeah.
I could see that. Would you encourage people contributing to open source projects today to find one that is in a language they know well, or maybe try to learn one in a different language?
It depends where you're at in your journey as a programmer. if you're very early on, you should pick one in a language that you know better than other languages, because you're going to have to learn a lot about the project and all the details of its code. And trying to learn that and a programming language at the same time is not something I would recommend.
In software, what is a chief architect and what does that function do?
Sure. So it's different, I think, at different scopes and different sizes of organization. So in the Bugzilla project, my job was to decide on the code architecture of the system. And that's more like a tech lead role, I would say, in many companies today, where, hey, people are like, hey, we want to design it this way. We want to design it this way. You're the decider. You're saying we're going to design it this way. You're publishing the standards and you're reviewing the changes and you're saying, no, don't do it that way. Do it this way. And I have the final say on how the thing is going to go. I mean, obviously, it should always be a discussion. If other people have a really good technical point, you should be willing to listen to them. But your job is to maintain consistency, but also to maintain simplicity and clarity as the system grows.
You mentioned technical lead. I've heard people talk about that role in different aspects. We talked to a guest who was a technical lead in IT operations. So when you say technical lead in the software development world, is that normally showing up as an individual contributor with sort of decision-making abilities over what the team will do and the direction they'll go rather than a people manager?
To some degree, yes. So there's different types of tech leads, and we could maybe get into this more once we get into my current role, but let's just talk about it now. Let's just talk about the different types. And I'm going to call them by the names that they are frequently called.
Okay.
Google has a maybe slightly different term for some of these, but I'm going to call them by the names that I hear the most frequently used. So at the beginning, you're either like a software engineer or you're a senior software engineer. These are sort of the different levels of the tech hierarchy. And the way that you think of a software engineer is this person can write code, but they don't have enough experience to do it on their own without supervision. Like they maybe write things the wrong way. They frequently make bugs in their systems. They don't really know what the best practices are of the languages or systems they're working on. Next is a senior. A senior is a person who can be trusted to independently write changes on their own. They can own a feature from end to end and they can deliver that feature. And you just tell them, go write this feature, and they go do it, and you're not really worried that they're going to do it wrong. Next would be the level that, at least at LinkedIn, we call staff. A staff is the first level that's like what we really consider a tech lead. And so tech leads have varying duties depending on the team and the nature of the team, and how many reports your manager has. Like if your manager has 15 reports, then you're going to have some managerial duties because even if your title isn't manager, you're going to be doing some things that look more manager-like. If your manager has 3 reports and you're the tech lead, you're not going to be doing any managerial things, or at least you shouldn't be. But what that person is doing is, they are setting the architecture for the system. They're assuring its quality. They're deciding on the overall design. They're making any major technical decisions like, what data store you're going to use, what language, what framework, things like that. They are helping guide the team towards improving their craft of software engineering. And they are also a connective tissue between their team and other teams at the company. So they're the technical connective tissue. So if you have to interact with another system that you depend on, then the staff engineer is there and they're going and they're talking to that other team. Occasionally, a staff engineer has maybe 2 teams or 3 teams they're tech leading, although that starts to get rare as it gets larger. The next level is senior staff. Senior staff is basically, you can think of it as a person who owns multiple staff level projects. But the nature of the role really starts to change. So senior staffs are usually still writing code, still reviewing code, but they are doing a lot more strategic work. There might be 20, 30 engineers that they are leading, or a project of very large scope and complexity that involves coordination with, 10, 20 teams across the company in a large company. And this is a person who you can trust to be like, hey, you own this whole problem. Like I could say, you own internal search for the company, period. And that's your whole statement. That's all I tell you. And then you deliver internal search. There's no other direction that I give you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's senior staff engineer. A lot more of their time is involved in strategic work. So writing documents that say, here's the overall plan for a project that's going to take 6 months to 2 years. Here's how I'm going to coordinate these 3 or 4 teams to all get this work done. And I'm going to be the central review point for all large technical decisions that involve this large, complicated system. Above that is principal. At this level, you're getting further away from coding on a day-to-day basis. There are principals who still code, but it becomes less and less common to be frequently coding. At this level, you are working strategically. At this level, you can think of you own a problem for the company. So like at LinkedIn, I'm a principal. Let's say in the past, I have owned a problem like engineering metrics for the company. The whole instruction that I get is, okay, go make engineering more data-driven. That's it. Then I got to solve that problem. And all of that's on me. And I've got somewhere between 30 and 100 engineers. And I'm going to go and coordinate their work and strategize and go talk to various vice presidents of engineering and go talk to other leads across the company. And I'm going to write plans and I'm going to be the technical reviewer for a lot of things. And I'm going to be designing things. I mean, it's still my job to cause software to be built. I think, managers, their job might be to get work done, like to cause work to be done and to handle performance and to make sure that people are performing adequately and to assure that people are delivering the things that they've committed to on their deadlines. My job is we have a technical vision. We need to get that technical vision delivered. And my job is to do literally anything required at the company to get that technical vision delivered. At my level, there is no excuse that I cannot do something. I must be able to do anything that is required, any role that is required in order to accomplish whatever goal has been set for me. And then above that, there's like distinguished engineering. Distinguished engineers usually effectively owns like a notable portion of the company, like 10 to 20 to 30% of the company, and sets the vision for, an organization of hundreds and hundreds of engineers, or sets a vision that the whole company works on, things like that.
It seems like as you go up and up with the titles, the scope of the problem that you're solving gets larger, but it also seems like it's more ambiguous when it's given to you at first, and you have more responsibility to further refine the problem statement and how it is solved. Is that about right?
Yeah, when we talk about promotions, so I'm involved in promoting people from staff to senior staff, for example.
Oh, okay.
And I've been involved in a lot of promotion processes throughout my life. The primary thing we talk about is scope and ambiguity. That's the first thing we talk about. And then, of course, we absolutely care about people's technical skills and the feedback that they have from others and things like that. But the very first point of the ladder is scope and ambiguity.
And for those promotions, while we're on that topic, certainly you want to make a wider impact inside the company because your problem scope is larger. But is it also important to make an impact outside the company as well? A larger impact radius in the industry as part of that promotion process?
It depends on the level that you're at. And it depends on what the company's expectations are. So the company will have every company will have a different expectation. Usually, we don't expect you to have a broad impact on the outside world until you're at my level or above. I think that's an unreasonable expectation. Like most people aren't going to do that. Most people don't care about that. I think, at least as an engineer, what does matter is impact of the work that you've done. Like if you work on the product that your company makes, then you do need to have an impact on the world outside because that's the impact that your product has. But you have that work, like at a lower level, you have that work by writing the code that, forms up the product that users use. And then that code has impact because users get to use the new feature, or you fixed the bug, or you've made it faster, or whatever.
Maybe we haven't come out and said it before on the show, but an open source project is a technical community. I loved Max's advice to look at the tone and the culture of the community around an open source project. We'd probably do the same before joining a user group or other online forum, so why not take those same things into consideration before you decide to contribute to any specific open source project? Have you thought about whether the scope of the problems you're solving in your job are increasing? Thinking about the way Max described the job levels for software engineers, this is a great way to present ourselves in interviews. Can you describe that process of the scope of problem increase in your role as you progress throughout your career? If we were to do that and look at it for Max, it goes like this. He started in bug triage. So his use of Bugzilla specifically was limited because of his lack of programming knowledge. So he was using the software as an end user would use it. He didn't really know a whole lot about the back-end system. Then he went to installing Bugzilla for a specific company. So he has to deploy it and then administer it for other people to be able to use it, probably setting some standards along the way for the way the data would be entered, which is 100% relatable experience from when he used the software for bug triaging. Then Max went to the next step, rewriting the code to release multi-database capabilities so that Bugzilla would support Postgres. He had learned more programming languages at this point. He had to learn about the release process, something that he didn't previously know much about, and he made an impact on the global Bugzilla distribution and community at large. And he even went so far as to refactor the code base over time and impact the architecture and systems design of the project. I think this idea of an increasing scope in our work, increasing scope in the problems we're solving extends way beyond software engineering to any technical career. So if the scope of the problems you're solving are not increasing, maybe you need to learn a new skill to enable that to happen. Think about it like this. If you've administered a system, but you've never deployed it or designed it, maybe the next step is working with more than one company to consult on that specific system. Learn about the design and the building of those specific systems that you've administered in different environments, doing that for different customers to get different perspectives on how it can be used. And I would also say, get to know your technical leads, whether it's IT operations, software development, architecture. Figure out how you can help those people. Maybe there's part of what needs to be done that they can delegate to you. Maybe they're solving a huge problem and designing this massive system that you know one component of really well. Could you shadow that person? Could you go and just ask to be part of some of the planning sessions that they are leading and communicating, being a part of, and maybe exposure to that kind of thing will give you the opportunity to start thinking in different ways, more strategically, more like someone who is a technical lead, so that when that opportunity comes up, you've not only built the technical skills, but you've built those planning skills and those higher level strategic skills that go along with being the technical lead of something. If you're looking for more discussions on the technical lead role, there are lots in the catalog, but I'll give you a couple to chew on. Episode 278 with Marnie Coffey, she talked about progressing into an IT operations technical lead. And then episode 247 with Dr. Shirisha Kuchimanchi, she talked about being a technical lead or a team lead. By the way, I'm recording this intro and outro from the road, so say hi to the family in the background here. If you like this episode, please take the time to rate us 5 stars and write a review. We'd really appreciate it, and it helps us reach more people. We'll see you next time.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.